Welcome to the anatomic and physiologic overview of the nervous system. Today we're going to be looking at structure and function of the nervous system. The nervous system consists of two major parts: the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the autonomic nervous system. The function of the nervous system is to control motor, sensory, autonomic, cognitive, and behavioral activities. The brain itself contains more than 100 billion cells that link the motor and sensory pathways, monitor the body's processes, respond to the internal and external environment, maintain homeostasis, and direct all psychological, biological, and physical activity through complex chemical and electrical messages. Let's look a little bit more closely at the layout of the nervous system. The nervous system has two main parts: the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all of the nerves that radiate from the structures in the central nervous system. The nervous system is organized so that the central nervous system is going to receive sensory information, as well as deliver motor output information. It receives from and delivers to the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the somatic nervous system, which is going to receive or send information to the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which is going to send and receive information from our visceral organs. The autonomic nervous system can then be further subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight response, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system, and then finally our GI tract that has its own nervous system, referred to as the enteric nervous system. So what is the function of the nervous system? The nervous system has a sensory function, where we're going to sense changes through sensory receptors, a motor function, where we are then going to respond to a stimulus, and most importantly, an integrative function, where we're going to analyze the information that comes in, store some of it, and then also use or make decisions regarding appropriate behaviors to respond to a stimuli. So, for example, if you get a phone call, the sensory is going to be receiving or hearing the phone ringing, and then you must integrate, decide what you're going to do. Are you going to answer the phone? Or are you going to ignore the call? From there, the motor output would decide if you pick up the phone or if you turn it over and act like nothing's happening. Here's your first question. Make sure to pause the video, answer the question, and then move on. Here's your next question. Again, please pause, answer, and then move on. The basic functional unit of the brain is the neuron. The neuron is composed of dendrites, a cell body, and an axon. The dendrites are branch-type structures for receiving electrochemical messages. The axon is a long projection that carries electrical impulses away from the cell body. Some axons have a myelinated sheath that increases the speed of conduction. Nerve cell bodies that occur in clusters are called ganglia, or nuclei. A cluster of cell bodies with the same function is called a center, such as the respiratory center. Neurons are supported, protected, and nourished by glial cells, which are 50 times greater in number than neurons. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that communicate messages from one neuron to another or to a specific target tissue. Neurotransmitters can potentiate, terminate, or modulate a specific action, or can excite or inhibit a target cell. Many neurologic disorders are caused by an imbalance in neurotransmitters. Let's talk a little bit about acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a cholinergic agonist. It makes cholinergic activity happen. It works on muscarinic or nicotinic receptors. Muscarinic receptors are found in gastric parietal cells, in the central nervous system, in the heart, in smooth muscle, exocrine glands, and the bladder. Nicotinic receptors are present in the central nervous system, the adrenal medulla, the autonomic ganglia, and neuromuscular junctions. Neuromuscular junctions are synaptic connections between the terminal end of a motor nerve and a muscle, which can be skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, or cardiac muscle. This is where the action potential is transmitted from the nerve to the muscle. Serotonin is a chemical that carries messages between nerve cells in the brain and throughout your body, and it plays a key role in such bodily functions as mood, sleep, digestion, nausea, wound healing, bone health, blood clotting, and sexual desire. Serotonin levels that are too low or too high can cause physical and psychological health problems. Lack of enough serotonin is thought to play a role in depression, anxiety, mania, and other health conditions. Most of the serotonin found in your body is in your gut. About 90% of serotonin is found in the cells lining your GI tract. It's released into your blood circulation and absorbed by platelets. Only about 10% is produced in your brain. Serotonin is made from the essential amino acid tryptophan. An essential amino acid means it can't be made by your body. It has to be obtained from the foods you eat. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it plays a role as a reward center and in many bodily functions, including memory, movement, motivation, mood, attention, and more. High or low dopamine levels are associated with diseases, including Parkinson's disease, restless leg syndrome, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Dopamine also acts as a hormone. Dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine are the main catecholamines. This is because they have part of the same molecular structure. These hormones are made by your adrenal gland. It's a small hat-shaped gland located on top of each of your kidneys. Dopamine is also a neural hormone released by the hypothalamus in your brain. Norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. As a neurotransmitter, it's a chemical messenger that helps transmit nerve signals across nerve endings to another nerve cell, muscle cell, or gland cell, and as a hormone is released by your adrenal glands, which are hat-shaped glands that sit on top of each kidney. I know I'm repeating myself. I want to make sure you guys know this. Okay. Norepinephrine is made from dopamine. It's made from nerve cells in the brainstem area of your brain and in an area near your spinal cord. Norepinephrine is part of the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of your body's emergency response system to danger, the fight or flight response. Medically, the fight or flight response is known as the acute stress response. GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It slows your brain down by blocking specific signals in your central nervous system. GABA is known for producing a calming effect. It's thought to play a major role in controlling nerve cell hyperactivity that is associated with anxiety, stress, and fear. Enkephalins are endogenous, meaning from within the body, opioid pentapeptides that are produced mainly in the central nervous system, the adrenal medulla, and other peripheral tissues. Enkephalins possess virtually all the properties of the morphine opiates. In the brain, they appear to play the role of the neurotransmitter or neuromodulator of specific neuronal systems that mediate the integration of sensory information related to pain and emotional behavior. Their role in the GI tract remains kind of unclear. There is evidence that enkephalins stimulate acid secretion and inhibit pancreatic enzymes and bicarbonate secretions from the pancreas. There is also evidence that opiate peptides can suppress the release of somatostatin and increase the release of insulin and glucagon from the pancreas. Endorphins are chemicals your body releases when it feels pain or stress. They're released during pleasurable activities such as exercise, massage, eating, and sex, too. Endorphins help relieve pain, reduce stress, and improve your sense of well-being. Endorphins are created in your pituitary gland and hypothalamus, both located in the brain. Endorphins attach to the brain's reward centers, the opioid receptors, and carry signals across. Endorphins come from the word endogenous, which means within the body, and morphine, an opiate pain reliever. Put together, that means endorphins are natural pain relievers. They're feel-good chemicals. They can make you feel better and put you in a positive state of mind. Okay, let's look at the principal parts of the brain. The outermost part of the brain is known as the cerebrum. This is what you would see if you are holding a brain in your hand. The innermost part of the brain are the ventricles. The ventricles are empty cavities inside of the brain that actually hold the cerebrospinal fluid. The next part of the brain is the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made up of three major parts. You have the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the thalamus. The next principal part of the brain is going to be the brainstem. The brainstem sits just inferior to the cerebrum. It includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The next part is the cerebellum. The cerebellum sits inferior to the cerebrum and posterior to the brainstem. The cerebellum has two major parts. You have the outer cerebellum cortex, which is gray matter, and on the inside you have the white matter, which we refer to as the arbor vitae because of its tree shape. The brain is protected by three major layers. The outermost layer of protection is the cranial bones, or your skull. The next layer is connective tissue layer known as the cranial meninges. This is going to include the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. The last layer of protection of the brain is the cerebrospinal fluid. So if we take a closer look at the meninges of the brain, we will notice that we have the arachnoid mater, which is very similar and continuous with the arachnoid mater of the spinal cord. And just deep to the arachnoid mater, we have what's known as the subarachnoid space. This space is important because this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be located. Deep to the subarachnoid space and to the arachnoid mater and continuous with the lining of all the actual cerebrum, we have the pia mater. The outermost layer of our cranial meninges is actually the dura mater. Unlike the spinal cord, which only has one layer, the dura mater has two layers. These two layers are mostly fused together, except where they separate in order to enclose the venous sinuses of the dural part of the brain. These sinuses are there to drain venous blood from the brain and deliver that venous blood to the internal jugular vein, which will then eventually return it to the heart. These are normally known as the superior sagittal sinus, and there's also other sinuses throughout the brain as well. The space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater is known as the subdural space, and in this space we have interstitial fluid. Another structure that's important and a part of the cranial meninges is known as the arachnoid granulation villi. These structures are important for reabsorption of cerebrospinal fluid. So the dura mater also has different extensions. The dura mater extends down in order to separate the two hemispheres. This extension is known as the falx cerebri. The next extension is the falx cerebelli. In this extension, we're going to separate the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. The third extension of the dura mater is the tentorium cerebelli. This extension separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay, we've got some questions here. I'm just going to flip through. I expect you guys to pause, answer the questions, and then move on. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the bones of the skull other than to say you need to learn where each of those bones and sutures is. You need to know what they're called. These are the landmarks you're going to need to know for your assessments. So now let's talk about the blood flow to the brain. The blood flows to the brain by way of the vertebral and carotid arteries. It flows away from the brain and back to the heart by way of the jugular veins. The brain utilizes about 20% of the body's oxygen and glucose supply. Unlike other parts of the body, the neural cells are unable to undergo lactic acid fermentation, so they have an absolute requirement for both glucose and oxygen in order to have energy. Any interruption of the oxygen supply to the brain can result in weakening, and if that interruption is too long, it can also result in permanent damage or even death of the brain cells. And because the brain cells must undergo cellular respiration for energy, glucose is also essential. A glucose deficiency may produce mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and unconsciousness. This is especially important in patients that may be diabetic, as they have to be very aware that they have an adequate amount of glucose for brain activity. When we refer to the blood that is flowing to the brain, it's important to note that there is a barrier between the blood and the brain cells. This barrier is known as the blood-brain barrier, or the BBB. The blood-brain barrier protects the brain cells from harmful substances and pathogens by acting as a selective barrier and preventing the passage of many other substances that are found in the blood into the brain. Lipid-soluble substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones, alcohol, and nicotine can pass readily through this barrier. However, molecules like proteins and antibiotics are not able to pass at all. Water and glucose, which are very important for brain activity, can pass by way of facilitated diffusion. The blood-brain barrier is established by creating tight junctions with the endothelial cells of the blood capillaries that go to the brain. The blood-brain barrier can also prevent good things from getting into the brain. The blood-brain barrier can prevent entry of therapeutic drugs, and so it is important when designing drugs that need to go to the brain to take the blood-brain barrier into account. Entry to the brain can also cause a breakdown of this blood-brain barrier. If this occurs, this may permit passage of substances that normally would not be able to get into the brain tissue. More questions, guys? Please pause and answer. Let's look at the cerebrospinal fluid of the brain. In total, an adult makes about 80 to 150 milliliters of this fluid. This liquid protects the brain and the spinal cord against chemical and physical injury, and it delivers oxygen, glucose, and other important substances from the blood to the nervous tissue cell. The cerebrospinal fluid is synthesized and found in the ventricles of the brain. Starting with the lateral ventricles, the cerebrospinal fluid travels from the lateral ventricles to the interventricular foramen. Then from there it goes to the third ventricle, and then travels down the aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. From there it leaves out of the lateral aperture and the median aperture to go towards the spinal cord and the central canal of the spinal cord. Now let's take a closer look at exactly how and where the cerebrospinal fluid is made. Choroid plexuses are found within the ventricles, and this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be synthesized. A choroid plexus is a network of capillaries that are found in the walls of the ventricles, and they are covered by ependymal cells. These ependymal cells are what are going to make the cerebrospinal fluid. These cells act as a filter and basically filter the blood plasma through them. And what comes out on the other side and goes toward the brain is going to be your cerebrospinal fluid. Because of the tight junctions between these ependymal cells, fluid cannot leak between the cells and must go through them, and therefore this serves as the blood-cerebrospinal fluid barrier. So now let's look at the total flow. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but let's look at it closer. In the lateral ventricles, you have the choroid plexuses. You also have choroid plexuses in the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle as well. The cerebrospinal fluid made in each of these is going to start first in the lateral ventricles and then travel to the third ventricle by way of the interventricular foramina. From the third ventricle, you have the choroid plexuses that are making cerebrospinal fluid, but you also have cerebrospinal fluid entering the fourth ventricle by way of the aqueduct of the midbrain. After leaving the fourth ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid is now going to move into the subarachnoid space of both the brain and the spinal cord. This happens through holes known as the lateral and median apertures. After this, the arachnoid villi of our dural venous sinuses are going to reabsorb the cerebrospinal fluid. Reabsorption is equal to production by the choroid plexuses so that the pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid is constant. Once it is reabsorbed, the cerebrospinal fluid goes into the venous blood, where it then returns to the heart and eventually goes through circulation. And after that, arterial blood returns back to the brain, and then we start the process all over again at the choroid plexuses. Now that we've gone through the steps of the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, let's look at it again using an image of the brain to track where the cerebrospinal fluid originates and where it goes. So, starting with the choroid plexuses that are found in the right and left lateral ventricles, that's where we're going to make our cerebrospinal fluid. From there, this cerebrospinal fluid is going to travel into the third ventricle by way of the interventricular foramen. Recall that the third ventricle also contains a choroid plexus, and it is making its own cerebrospinal fluid while also receiving cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricles. From there, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to travel by way of the cerebral aqueduct or the aqueduct of the midbrain, and then it's going to go into the fourth ventricle. Like the lateral ventricles and the third ventricles, the fourth ventricles also have choroid plexus associated. That's making its own cerebrospinal fluid, also receiving cerebrospinal fluid from those earlier ventricles. After leaving the fourth ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to exit into the subarachnoid space by way of the median aperture as well as the lateral aperture. From there, it's going to travel or circulate through the subarachnoid space. It also goes into the central canal of the spinal cord as well. Remember, after it gets into the subarachnoid space, there are arachnoid granulation villi, which are going to reabsorb the cerebrospinal fluid and take it or return it to the venous blood. It's returned by way of the superior sagittal sinus, and from there, it goes to the internal jugular vein. Here's some more questions. Please make sure you pause. Now let's look at some other structures of the brain. We're going to start with the brainstem, but then we're going to work our way all the way through the different parts of the brain. So starting with the brainstem, there are three major structures. You have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla oblongata is continuous with the superior aspect of the spinal cord. So it's the bottommost or most inferior portion of the brain. It contains portions of both motor and sensory. Also, on the medulla oblongata, we have nuclei for some of our cranial nerves as well. The nuclei of the cranial nerves include that of the vestibulocochlear nerve, the hypoglossal nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the accessory nerves. We will be talking about all of these nerves in more detail later. We've already talked about these structural regions, but I do want to point out the inferior olivary nuclei. These nuclei receive input from the cerebral cortex, the midbrain, and the spinal cord and send that information to the cerebellum. This allows for adjustments to muscle activity as you start to learn a new skill. Kind of like, putting in a catheter or an IV, those kind of skills. And just to recall, a nucleus is a congregation of cell bodies found in the central nervous system. This is synonymous with ganglia that are found in the peripheral nervous system. The functional regions of the medulla oblongata include several different centers. We have the cardiovascular center, which is going to control heart rate and vasoconstriction. We have the respiratory center, which is going to control the respiratory rate. We have a vomiting center, which is going to control vomiting. A deglutition center controls swallowing, and as well, we have other functional regions that control things like coughing, sneezing, and hiccuping. The next structure of the brain is the pons. Pons translates as bridge. The pons is located superior to the medulla oblongata, and as the name suggests, it links part of the brain with another one by way of tract. The pons is made up of two major regions. You have the ventral region and the dorsal region. The ventral region is going to contain pontine nuclei, which connect the cerebral cortex to the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. And then you have the dorsal, which is going to contain ascending and descending tracts, and also several cranial nerve nuclei. Nuclei for the cranial nerves that are found in the pons include the nuclei for the trigeminal nerve, the abducens nerve, the facial nerve, and the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Functionally, the pons is going to relay nerve impulses related to voluntary skeletal muscle movements from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. Also, it contains a pontine respiratory group, which helps the medulla oblongata control your breathing. More questions? Please pause, guys. Get the most out of this. The next structure that is a part of the brainstem is the midbrain. The midbrain is located superior to the medulla oblongata and extends from the pons to the diencephalon area of the brain. The posterior region of the midbrain contains elevations with nuclei known as the superior colliculi, the inferior colliculi, and together these colliculi are referred to as the tectum of the midbrain. On the anterior portion of the midbrain, we have these tracts known as cerebral peduncles. The corticospinal tracts are going to go from cerebrum to the spinal cord, and as well, we have corticobulbar tracts, which go from the cerebrum to the medulla oblongata. And then we have corticopontine tracts, which are going to connect the cerebrum to the pons. All of these tracts can be found in the cerebral peduncles. So if you take a closer look at the cranial nerves that contain nuclei in the midbrain, we have the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve. Both of these cranial nerves are important for motor impulses that control your eyes. In the structural regions of the midbrain, we've already discussed the cerebral peduncles as well as the tectum and the associated colliculi, but there are also two other structures that we should note. First, we have the neurons of the substantia nigra. These are important for controlling subconscious muscle activities. Loss of these neurons have been associated with Parkinson's disease. Another structure is the red nuclei. They are called this because they have a rich blood supply and iron-containing pigment, and that makes them actually appear red. These are also important for controlling muscular movements. So when we look at the functional regions of the midbrain, these are going to convey motor impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and the spinal cord. This happens by way of the peduncles. Also, it's going to send sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus and also regulate auditory and visual reflexes. These occur at the different colliculi of the tectum. Another structure that is not necessarily or even particularly associated with the midbrain, but is still important for brain activity, is the reticular formation. Much of the brain consists of small clusters of neuronal cell bodies that are interspersed among small bundles of myelinated axons. So there are these broad regions where white matter and gray matter exhibit a net-like arrangement. And this is what is known as a reticular formation. The reticular formation is going to help us regulate muscle tone, and it also alerts the cortex to incoming sensory signals. It's also responsible for our maintenance of consciousness and awakening from sleep. This just depicts where the reticular formation is located in relation to the other parts of the brain stem. So in this figure, you can see your tectum, and because we're looking down, or this is a superior view, we can see the superior colliculus or the superior colliculi. As well, we can also see the red nucleus in the substantia nigra. And in this part of the brainstem, between the colliculi and the substantia nigra, we find our reticular formation. The reticular formation extends from the superior spinal cord through the brainstem and all the way to the diencephalon. The ascending portion of the reticular formation is referred to as the reticular activating system, or the RAS. This is going to be activated by stimuli such as visual and auditory stimuli, mental activities, as well as stimuli from pain, touch, and pressure receptors. It is also activated by proprioceptors found in the limbs and the head. This system, the RAS system, is important for consciousness, attention, and alertness, and it is also responsible for subconsciously filtering out insignificant information. So if this isn't functioning properly, you have someone who cannot tune out things that aren't really important for them to pay attention to. For example, let's say you're sitting in a room full of people. You can read a book because you're able to filter out all the noise around you. In this, activation of the RAS is going to stimulate arousal and awakeness. This allows you to wake up. Inactivation of RAS causes you or allows you to fall asleep. Damage of the RAS can result in a coma, where a person is unable to actually wake up from sleep. The interesting thing about the RAS is that it does not receive input from receptors in the nose. So odors are not associated with arousing you from sleep. This becomes really important, for example, if you're in a fire. Even though there's smoke in the room, the smell of smoke does not actually wake you up. That's not what's going to arouse you because the system does not receive any input from the nose. Therefore, a lot of times people will remain asleep even when their house is on fire unless something else happens that alerts them to wake up, such as, heat or people yelling, things like that. Okay, into the questions, guys. Please get the most out of this. Pause, answer, and then move on. So the next structure we're going to look at in the brain is the cerebellum. Remember, the cerebellum occupies the inferior and posterior aspect of the cranial cavity. The cerebellum, like the cerebrum, has two hemispheres that are separated by an enlargement known as the central vermis. The cerebellum is going to govern your subconscious muscle movements. So, for example, when you go for a walk, you might not even realize, but your arms swing back and forth when you're walking. These are subconscious muscle movements that you're not actively thinking about as you're walking, but they involve your voluntary skeletal muscles. My guess is this has something to do with how my hands constantly move when I'm talking, but you all have me in class, so you know about that. In the cerebellum, there are three peduncles. We have the superior, inferior, and middle peduncles. These are important for attachment of the cerebellum to the brainstem. Also in the cerebellum, we have the floccular nodular lobe. This lobe is important for helping the body maintain equilibrium and balance. The cerebellum can be further divided into its gray and its white matter. The cerebellar cortex, or the outside of the cerebellum, is made up of gray matter. The inner portion of the cerebellum is made up of white matter, and as I said earlier, is referred to as the arbor vitae because of its tree-like shape. The functions of the cerebellum include coordination of skeletal muscle contractions and also maintaining normal muscle tone. This allows for our muscles to always kind of have a little bit of a contraction so they're not completely flaccid. This is important for things like posture and being able to stand or sit up straight, and also for balance. More questions, guys. So the next structure in the brain is the diencephalon. The diencephalon has three major parts to it: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The thalamus is a superior portion of the diencephalon. It is located superior to the midbrain and contains nuclei that serve as a relay station for all of our sensory impulses except for our sense of smell. They send these impulses to our cerebral cortex. The thalamus actually has 7 major groups of nuclei. These include the reticular nuclei, which monitor, filter, and integrate activities of the thalamic nuclei. The midline nucleus, which is presumed to function in memory and olfaction. Next, we have the lateral group, which is made up of 3 different nuclei or 3 different areas. These are going to receive input from the limbic system, the superior colliculi, and the cerebral cortex, and they are going to send output to the cerebral cortex. Now we have the medial nuclei. The medial nuclei receive input from the limbic system and the basal nuclei, and then send output to the cerebral cortex. Along with this, let's talk about the intralaminar nuclei. That's actually number 7, but let's talk about it now. These are inside of the thalamus, and they are involved in a wide variety of cognitive functions and work with the medial nuclei in areas such as memory processing, attention, learning, cognition, and orienting, as well as reward-based behaviors. The next nuclei is the ventral group. This is actually made up of 5 different groups of nuclei. They receive input from the basal nuclei and also send output to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Because of this, they function in movement control. The anterior nuclei receive input from the hypothalamus and send output to the limbic system. This is important for emotions and memory. The next structure in the diencephalon, just inferior to the thalamus, is the hypothalamus. Pronounce it however you want. Hippo, meaning lower. It's inferior to the thalamus. The hypothalamus has 4 major regions and controls many of our body's activities. The hypothalamus is actually the body's most important regulator of homeostasis, and we all know how the human body loves homeostasis. The 4 regions of the hypothalamus include the mammillary region, the tuberal region, the supraoptic region, and the preoptic region. Guys, don't get too hung up on all this. I just want you to have a basic understanding. The functions of these regions include control of our autonomic nervous system. Here's the important stuff. This is going to regulate your nervous system or organ activities like heart rate and the movement of food through our digestive system, our GI tract, and contraction of the bladder. The hypothalamus is also very important for the production of hormones. Hormones produced by the hypothalamus are sent to the pituitary gland, where they are then sent throughout the circulatory system to their target organs. The hypothalamus has structures that are important for regulating emotional and behavioral patterns, and this can be rage, aggression, pain, pleasure, or sexual arousal. The hypothalamus also regulates eating and drinking and contains a feeding center, a satiation center, that means you know you've had enough, and a thirst center. The hypothalamus also acts as our body's thermostat and controls our body temperature. Another very important function of the hypothalamus is regulation of our circadian rhythm, or our body's internal clock, which helps us to establish our sleep-wake cycle. And let's be honest, a lot of you guys are screwing that up now or are about to screw it up by working night shift. The third structure of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. The epithalamus lies superior and posterior to the thalamus. So look at the picture, find it. And it contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland is important because it secretes melatonin and contains the habernular nuclei. Melatonin is important because it helps us regulate our circadian rhythm. A lot of times people who are having trouble sleeping will take melatonin supplements in order to supplement their pineal gland. The habernular nuclei are involved in our emotional response to odors. So it's involved in olfaction, but it doesn't actually tell you what the smell is. It doesn't tell you that. It's just involved in how you respond to the smell, such as feeling happy when you smell brownies, or feeling stressed or angry if you smell the cologne of one of your old boyfriends or girlfriends that made you very mad. Parts of the diencephalon, known as the circumventricular organs, or CVOs, can monitor chemical changes in the blood because these parts actually lack the blood-brain barrier. CVOs include part of the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. These CVOs help coordinate homeostatic activities of both the endocrine and the nervous system and allow for the regulation of blood pressure, fluid balance, hunger, and thirst. Okay, more questions, guys. Make sure to pause. So the biggest portion of the brain is our cerebrum. And the cerebral cortex, or the outermost portion, which is composed of gray matter, is going to contain billions, that's billions with a B, of neurons. The cerebrum is composed of a bunch of gyri, fissures, and sulci, and they can be identified on the cortex. So when you look at the picture of the brain, all those different folds and dips are not random. Each of them has a specific purpose. Deep to the cortex, we have the white matter. This is composed of tracts of neurons that connect parts of the brain to each other, as well as to the spinal cord. A bundle of white matter tracts are called the corpus callosum, and it also connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. So now let's take a closer look at the details of the cerebral cortex. As you can see, the cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And the cerebral cortex is divided into different lobes. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Notice that these lobes correspond with the names of the cranial bones where the lobes are found. So if you didn't actually learn the names and locations of the cranial bones, please make sure you do that. You do actually need the information I'm giving you guys. Separating the left and the right hemisphere, you have a deep groove known as the longitudinal fissure. As well, we have a precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus that are across a shallower groove known as the central sulcus. So just to recap those vocabulary words, a gyrus is a fold of the brain. A sulcus is the shallower grooves between the gyri, and a fissure is a very deep groove between the folds, and the most common of the fissures is going to be our longitudinal fissure. On the end side of the cerebrum, we have our cerebral white matter tracts. Remember, the outer cortex of the cerebrum is gray matter, and the inner portion is white matter. So in these tracts, we have association tracts, and they're going to conduct nerve impulses between the gyri in the same hemisphere of the cerebrum. We also have commissural and projection tracts. The commissural tracts include the anterior commissure and the corpus callosum, as well as the posterior commissure, which we cannot see in this image. These are going to conduct nerve impulses from gyri to the corresponding gyri on the opposing cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so the tracts stay in the same hemisphere. The association tracts, stay in the same hemisphere, and the commissural tracts go across to the opposite hemisphere. For our projection tracts, these are going to be able to conduct nerve impulses from the cerebrum to the lower parts of the central nervous system, such as the thalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. These tracks go in both directions. So they go from the cerebrum to the lower parts, as well as from the lower parts back to the cerebrum. So association tracks stay inside one hemisphere. Commissural tracks go across the hemispheres, and projection tracks go from the cerebral area down into the lower parts of the brain. Okay, got a question here, guys. Make sure to pause. The cerebrum also contains several different nuclei. These are referred to as the basal nuclei. These are paired masses of gray matter that are found in each of our cerebral hemispheres. The basal nuclei include the globus pallidus nuclei, the putamen nuclei, and the caudate nuclei. The globus pallidus and the putamen together form what's known as the lentiform nucleus. And this lentiform nucleus and the caudate nuclei together form what's known as the corpus striatum. These nuclei are important for receiving input from the cerebral cortex and providing output to the motor portions of the cerebral cortex by way of the thalamus. These also regulate the initiation and termination of our movements, as well as subconscious muscle contractions, like those arms swinging when you run or jog, or also when you think about it, if a person tells you a joke and you subconsciously start to laugh without forcing yourself to laugh, this is also controlled by those basal nuclei. The next system in the brain that we're going to talk about is the limbic system. This is less defined because it's in different parts of the brain. It encircles the upper part of the brainstem, goes around the corpus callosum, and contains parts of the inner border of the cerebrum and the floor of the diencephalon. So make sure you look at the picture and follow this around. It's comprised of anterior and medial groups of thalamic nuclei, as well as mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus. The limbic system also includes the amygdala, which is a group of neurons that are close to the tail of the caudate nucleus of the basal nuclei. In the cerebrum, it is composed of these three structures, and the entire part that's a part of the cerebrum is referred to as the limbic lobe. The limbic system is referred to as our emotional brain, and that's because it plays a primary role in our emotions. It can affect our emotions for pain, pleasure, affection, anger. A very important structure for these is the amygdala, and it has been shown that damage to the amygdala can cause people to not be able to recognize fearful expressions or be able to express fear when they should. So, for example, if there are people running and everyone seems to be afraid of something, people with damage to the amygdala don't really understand what's going on and understand that they might be in danger too. Also, when a person with damage to the amygdala does feel fear, they don't show it outwardly. They don't show it on their face. Another important function of the limbic system is going to be our memory function. Question, guys. Pause. Let's talk a little bit about all the different parts of the cerebral cortex and how they are important for different functions of our body. We have sensory areas, which are responsible for receiving sensory signals, motor areas, which are responsible for delivering motor output, and association areas, which are more responsible for integrative signals and processing. The first of the functional areas that we're going to discuss in this lecture is the primary sensory cortex. This is a sensory area of the cerebral cortex that receives impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, itching, tickling, temperature, pain, and proprioception. This part of the cerebral cortex contains what is known as a sensory homunculus. Homunculus actually translates to little human. So what this part of the brain has, or the cerebral cortex has, is basically a map of your entire body, and is found in this area so that when you feel a sensation in a part of the body, it has a map that knows where that sensation is coming from. Pause this, take a close look at the picture. It's kind of interesting. Another sensory area is the primary visual area, and this is responsible for visual perception. A third sensory area is the primary auditory area. The primary auditory area is responsible for auditory reception. If we move on to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, we start with the primary motor area. This motor area is responsible for contraction of specific skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body. So the primary motor area on the left is going to be responsible for contraction of skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. Like the primary sensory area, the primary motor area also contains a homunculus called the motor homunculus. There are crude differences between the sensory area and the motor area, however. For example, in this part of the motor area, more cortex is going to be devoted to muscles that have complex movements. So, for example, we use our fingers for very precise, complex movements and delicate movements. So we're going to have more cortex devoted to our fingers than we do for our toes, which really don't do a whole lot. Another motor area is Broca's area. This area is referred to as the area for production of speech. This involves coordinated contractions of your speech and your breathing muscles that enable you to speak. And this area works closely with the primary motor area as well as a premotor area to make speech happen. Damage to this area can cause a person to not be able to form words in order to articulate their thoughts. Next, we're going to move on to some of our association areas. The somatosensory association area is an association area that allows you to determine things like the shapes and textures of an object, as well as an orientation of an object relative to another object by way of touch. It's also responsible for your memory of past somatosensory experiences so that you remember that when you touch a pencil, you don't have to remember that a pencil is a pencil every single time. It just stores that in your memory. Another association area is the visual association area. This is responsible for recognizing and integrating visual stimuli. So again, you can recognize objects you see often. You see a pencil, you know that a pencil is a pencil because you've seen pencils before. Another association area is our auditory association area. Like the visual association area, it's associated with recognizing objects or recognizing visual stimuli. And the auditory association area is responsible for recognizing sounds. So this allows you to tell the difference between when a person is talking versus when a person is singing, or if you're listening to music, or if you're hearing a loud noise. Another association area is Wernicke's area. This is the area that is responsible for understanding speech. It allows you to recognize words and translate those words into thoughts. Damage to this area allows you to be able to speak, but your words don't make any logical sense. You kind of create a word salad. So think of this in opposition to the Broca speech area, where you can think. You can have logical thoughts, but you're not able to actually speak them. With Wernicke's area, you can speak all you want, but none of it's going to make sense. Another association area is the somatic motor association area, also known as the premotor area. This area allows for muscles to contract in specific sequences, and it creates a memory bank for these movements. So, for example, in order to write your name, you have to memorize all the different movements that your hand needs to make with the pencil, from holding the pencil to all of the different ways that you move your hand in order to write your name. You don't remember that because you were really little when you learned how to do that. But for those of you who have kids, be super patient. Their brain has to memorize every single step of the process. Another association area is our prefrontal cortex. This one is responsible for your personality, your decision-making processes, your intuition, and your ability to develop abstract thought. So in summary, Our cerebrum is going to contain sensory areas that are involved in perception of sensory information, motor areas that are involved in control of execution of voluntary movements, and association areas that are going to deal with the more complex integrated functions like memory, personality, traits, and intelligence. As well as in our cerebrum, we have our basal nuclei, which help us initiate as well as terminate movements and suppress unwanted movements and regulate muscle tone. And finally, we have our limbic system, which is found in parts of the cerebrum. And this system promotes our range of emotion, including pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, anger, and so on. Got a question here, guys. Pause. So, while the right and left hemispheres are equal in size, they are not equal in function. This is referred to as hemispheric lateralization. So, for example, the right hemisphere of the brain is going to receive somatic sensory signals from and control muscle movements on the left side of the body. It's also responsible for musical and artistic awareness, which is why a lot of time people who are very artistic or good at poetry or painting are called right-brained. That would not be me. It also is responsible for recognition of faces, as well as the emotional content of facial expressions. It's responsible for generating emotional content of language, and finally for identifying and discriminating among odors. On the left side of the brain, we're going to receive somatic sensory signals from and control muscle movements on the right side of the body. The left hemisphere is also responsible for reasoning, as well as numerical and scientific skills. A lot of times, people who are really good at math, engineering, and any type of science and logic are referred to as left-brained. Also in the left hemisphere, this is going to be responsible for our ability to understand sign language, as well as spoken and written language. Let's talk a little bit about how we measure brain activity. We can look at brain waves by way of an instrument known as an electroencephalogram or EEG, and the brain waves can give us ideas about the electrical activity that is occurring in the cerebral cortex. In a normal, awake adult, you have alpha waves, which are about 8 to 13 hertz, and these waves are going to disappear when the adult is sleeping. When you are undergoing some type of mental exercise, like, I don't know, taking a test or trying to figure out a complex problem, the brain will exhibit beta waves. These waves are a little larger than the alpha waves. They're 14 to 30 hertz. The next type of wave is the theta wave. These are going to appear when you're in emotional stress, and these are smaller than our alpha waves. They're only 4 to 7 hertz. Do you now understand why I harp on you guys so much about lowering your stress levels in order to do well on a test? We don't want theta waves when we're trying to take our tests. We want beta waves. And then finally, we have our delta waves. Delta waves are only present when we're asleep. They're small, about 1 to 5 hertz. If delta waves are present in an awake adult, this indicates some type of brain damage. Here's a question, guys. Make sure to pause. Now let's discuss the cranial nerves that are going to extend from our cranium. There are 12 cranial nerves, and we remember them by using the mnemonic on old Olympus's towering top, a Finn and German viewed a hop. Yeah, I know it's dumb, but it helps, guys. These correspond to the different cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 6 is the abducens nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 8 is actually the vestibulocochlear, but it used to be called the auditory nerve, so that's why it's an A instead of a V in the mnemonic. Cranial nerve 9 is our glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 11 is our accessory nerve. And finally, cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. And if we look at all of these different cranial nerves, we're going to notice that some of them are sensory nerves, others are motor nerves, and some have both sensory and motor activity. Starting with cranial nerve 1, or the olfactory nerve, this is a sensory nerve, and it is responsible for our sense of smell. Cranial nerve 2, or the optic nerve, is also a sensory nerve, and this is going to be responsible for our sense of sight. Cranial nerve 3 is a motor nerve. It is an ocular motor nerve. This motor nerve is responsible for our eyeball movements as well as adjusting the lens and pupil. Cranial nerve 4 is our trochlear nerve. It works with cranial nerve 3 in order to help move the eyeball around. Cranial nerve 5 is our trigeminal nerve. This is a mixed nerve. It has both sensory and motor functions. For sensory, this is going to include the sense of touch, pain, and thermal sensation in our mouth, our tongue, and parts of our face. Our motor functions from the trigeminal nerve include being able to chew. The abducens nerve, or cranial nerve 6, is also a motor nerve, and it actually works with cranial nerve 3 and 4, the ocular motor, and the trochlear nerve to move your eyeball around. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. This is also a mixed nerve that has both sensory and motor functions. On the sensory side, it's going to send stimuli for taste, touch, pain, and thermal sensation in the mouth and on the face. For motor function, it's going to send out motor input to muscles for facial expressions, as well as to the salivary gland and the lacrimal glands in order to secrete saliva and tears. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is a sensory nerve that is responsible for hearing and our sense of equilibrium. That's why it used to be called the auditory nerve. They made it vestibulocochlear, cochlear, thinking about your ears, and vestibulo because it really does help control how we manage our balance and our equilibrium. Cranial nerve 9 is our glossopharyngeal nerve. This also is a mixed nerve that has both sensory and motor areas. The sensory nerves are going to be responsible for taste, swallowing, proprioception, understanding where an object is in your mouth as you're swallowing it. And it's also going to monitor our blood pressure, oxygen, and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. It's also responsible for sensations of touch, pain, and thermal sensations in your ears and your throat. Kind of weird, interesting combo. The motor nerves are going to be responsible for swallowing as well as saliva secretions. The cranial nerve 10, that's our vagus nerve. The vagus nerve kind of steps outside the norm. It affects parts of the body outside of the head and neck region. It's a mixed nerve. It has both sensory and motor nerves. And the sensory portion is responsible for the taste you get in the back of your throat or at the epiglottis, as well as proprioception of your throat and voice box muscles. It's also able to monitor blood pressure, oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and receive stimuli for touch, pain, and thermal sensations of the ear, as well as sensations of your thoracic organs. The motor neurons of the vagus nerve are responsible for things like swallowing, vocalization, coughing, and autonomic activity, such as the mobility of the secretions in your gastrointestinal organs, constrictions of your respiratory pathways, your heart rate, and specifically decreasing your heart rate. Cranial nerve 11 is our accessory nerve. This is a motor nerve that is responsible for movement of your head. And our final cranial nerve 12 is our hypoglossal nerve. This is also a motor nerve that is responsible for the muscles that control speech, as well as manipulation of food in the mouth and swallowing. If you've got a question, guys, make sure to pause. So what happens to our nervous system as we age? Aging can result in an overall loss of neurons, as well as a diminished capacity for sending nerve impulses to and from the brain. We also sometimes lose our ability to process information, and the speed of conduction of our nerve impulses decreases overall. This can result in the slowing of voluntary motor movements and an increase in our reflex times, since we're not moving our impulses as fast as we used to. And finally, we can also see degenerative changes in our vision, our hearing, our sight, our taste, our smell, our touch, and our balance. So finally, let's talk about some of the homeostatic imbalances of the brain. First, let's look at cerebrovascular accident. We call it a stroke. This is characterized by a sudden onset of neurological symptoms due to damage of our brain tissue. These symptoms can include things like loss of sensation, paralysis, and sometimes even death. A more transient dysfunction of the cerebral cortex is referred to as a transient ischemic attack, or a TIA. TIAs are usually due to impaired blood flow and symptoms including things like loss of sensation, drooping of part of the face, and slurred speech. Finally, a more pronounced homeostatic imbalance of the brain is referred to as Alzheimer's disease. This disease affects our intellectual ability. With Alzheimer's disease, not only does a person begin to forget things like other people's names or their own address, they also forget how to do things such as how to put on a pair of pants or how to put a key into a lock. There's a lot more information that needs to be learned about Alzheimer's disease. It's currently still being studied by a lot of researchers. So here's a question. Make sure to pause. Let's do a wrap up. The brain is divided into the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The brain is protected by the cranial bones, the meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid. The brain is also protected from unwanted substances from the blood by two barriers, the blood-brain barrier and the blood-CSF barrier. The CSF is important for the brain because it protects and nourishes the brain. It's synthesized in the ventricles, circulated through the brain and the spinal cord, and returned to the venous blood. Extending from the brain are 12 cranial nerves that can contain sensory nerves, motor nerves, or both. Physiologically, the brain is responsible for maintaining homeostasis. Different functions of the brain are responsible for sensory functions and motor functions, as well as more complex integrated functions that occur in the body. One last question, guys. Pause.